Welcome to the Psychedelic Passage podcast. My name is Jimmy Nguyen. I will be your host today. Thank you for joining us with another week of this podcast. We do hope that folks are enjoying the content, enjoying the materials that we're putting out there. I personally think that we have a wide range of interesting topics that we discuss with listeners in our community, and I also hope that it's adding something. I hope it's adding something valuable to your experience or your exploration of using psychedelics in an intentional way. Today's episode, we get a lot of inquiries about, a lot of questions coming into our inbox and the different channels on how people can get in touch with us. And that is any thoughts around microdosing after a high dose psychedelic experience. So I'll be talking through some of my own thoughts and some considerations if you are thinking about whether microdosing a psychedelic is right for you after a high dose experience. And let's dive into that. So, I think the first thing that I would share for folks who are considering microdosing after a high dose experience is to just keep in mind that even after the effects of the substance or the altered state of consciousness is wearing off, a lot of folks talk about there being this, afterglow period sometimes of about 24 hours or so where you're not actively, tripping anymore, but there still is some type of alteration to your perspective or your state. And I would say that even in, a period of a couple of days after that, I very much feel like the experience is still unfolding. This is even after the effects, have worn off in the sense that one of the reasons why folks are seeking psychedelic experiences is some type of a shift or a change in their perspective, in their worldview. And so I would say that that phenomenon still can happen after a psychedelic experience. This is also important to note that folks come out of psychedelic experiences or large dose psychedelic experiences in a wide range of states, some more stable than others, depending on the experience that you had, depending on the content, of your life, depending on the intentions of which you went into the psychedelic experience with. Overall, I think generally reported is this need to recover and to rest and to take it a little bit easy, especially in the 2 to 3 days after a psychedelic experience. But I also find this to be true for a couple of weeks out as folks begin to, regulate their sleep again and their energy levels. And maybe folks are having to return to work or school or, something like that. So you've heard us say quite a few times on this podcast that there's no guarantee what comes up in a psychedelic experience. And also, I think that there's something to consider on what's your state like coming out of this psychedelic experience as it relates to microdosing. I also think that this type of state that I'm talking about also takes into account some things that aren't related to the psychedelic experience, just your current life content, the current environment that you're in, how stable you're feeling in your life. Maybe you're just at a point in your life where there's just a lot of stuff going on. You have a lot of content, a lot of big decisions, coming up. This is almost akin to why we suggest for folks to wait at least 30 days before they're making big, large decisions, after a psychedelic experience. And then also some other pieces of considering just your internal state. I'm talking about your energy levels after a psychedelic experience, your stress resilience, how vulnerable you might feel, how grounded and stable you might feel, your emotional state, what type of content is coming up. Is there emotions that are really challenging and hard to navigate? Or are you feeling like there's a wealth of, emotions that are beneficial to what's going on in your life right now? And then also your mental capacity. So I guess broadly what I'm speaking to here is that folks are coming out of psychedelic experiences in a wide range of states of being. And I think that microdosing after a high dose experience is directly related to that. I also have a little bit of a larger thought around, what your intentions are after a large dose experience as it relates to microdosing. So Some folks are wanting to potentially use microdosing as, let's say, an integration tool, which is something that I'll break down and talk about a little bit more later in this episode. And also, I want to name that there is sometimes this element of, how would I describe this? It's almost an element of wanting the psychedelic or the medicine or the substance to like do the work for you. This is also akin to folks wanting to come into a large dose psychedelic experience doing like the maximum dosage possible. They're like, I'm wanting the full effect here. I'm wanting, the psychedelic medicine to like do its thing. And I think if you're a person who is leaning into a large dose experience or even microdosing with this thought of like, man, if I can just do enough of this medicine, it's going to show me or the things I need to see, or it's going to do the work for me. I really invite you to just like pause for a second and just really think about what are your intentions around psychedelic work. I think if you look at this from a lens of, let's say, more like shamanic approaches or more, let's say, like cultural approaches to using psychedelics, it's very much different than what we see in our like clinical, Western North American culture, which is like use the substance to relieve an ailment or to relieve a condition or to relieve, a symptom. Whereas I think if you're looking at this more holistically, there's a lot of wisdom around thinking that, it's not just about what I'm going to do in using this substance or this medicine, or even, what I would call taking on a little bit more of like an extractive approach to psychedelic work. Meaning, like, I'm going to take this medicine, I'm going to consume it, I'm going to get what I need out of it. And then that's all that I have to decide. That's the end of the story. I think a more healthy way of approaching this is saying, oh, okay, these psychedelics are finite in nature. Not everybody has the opportunity to engage in psychedelics in the way that I am. And then you've heard me also even, take on a little bit more of like an animism approach to psychedelic work, in which to say these are substances and medicines that have an inherent intelligence to them. And possibly when I am consuming this psychedelic substance, the intelligence and the consciousness of this plant or this fungi is interacting with my own consciousness and intelligence. And that might be where some of this is working. And so, I guess what I'm speaking to here is that it's easy to talk about microdosing or macrodosing, microdosing after a large dose experience solely from the lens of like, what's the benefit to me? Like, what do I get out of it? And a large part that's, I wish was emphasized more in the psychedelic experience is to think a little bit broader about your relationship with the psychedelic medicine. And that can also inform a little bit more about whether I should engage with psychedelics again via a microdose. How soon? When? Does it feel right for my intentions and intuition? I just really invite folks to think along this piece. I know that in our society nowadays, a lot of work around psychedelics is very egocentric. It's about, what do I get out of it? What do I benefit? And then I will say that there's a lot of great intentions about, if I can, figure out my own internal stuff, then I can maybe show up back into my life, back into community, as a better parent or friend or brother, sister, and all of those different roles. And so, before I dive further into this list, I thought it was worth us to have a little bit of that dialogue about thinking about your intentions. Not only what are you trying to get out of it with microdosing after a high dose experience, but what is it that you are seeking as far as a gift and how you show back up in community, how you show back up for others, And I think that that is really embedded in a lot of native and indigenous wisdom that I've been lucky to overhear in conversations. Another way that my friend Sutton King was breaking down in a podcast episode we had back over Thanksgiving is, what is what I'm doing today? How does that impact 7 generations, down the road? And so I think you're understanding what I'm sharing, and that the decision to not only engage in psychedelics, but also microdosing after a large dose experience is not just about what's my benefit? What can I get out of this psychedelic medicine? I think it's a larger conversation to that. So, with all that being considered, I think that when you're thinking about microdosing after a large dose experience, there's a couple of things that I pay attention to. One is really just noting from a physiological standpoint that your dosage tolerance will likely vary after a large dose experience. This is especially probably noticeable for folks who might have been microdosing leading up to a macrodose experience. You might be used to a certain dosage or whatnot. And this is purely anecdotal. But what I find is that folks need much less of a dose post high dose experience. I don't think that this is like a physiological thing. I think this is very much more of maybe like a psycho spiritual, or something about just your sensitivities being a little bit more heightened. My best guess is that, especially when we're looking at the traditional psychedelic psilocybin, MDMA, LSD, I feel like your awareness is just a little bit more heightened after an experience. You're just probably noticing more things in your body, in your life, in your mind. And so that's kind of my guess, my best indicator on why folks generally have a little bit more of a sensitivity to psychedelics after a large dose. And I'm talking about, anywhere from a couple of days to maybe even for folks like a couple of weeks after an experience. So just keep that in mind. Like if you were to go through a large dose experience and you're used to microdosing at the certain, amount or level, I think that a recalibration or readjustment in your dosage, I think, makes the most sense here. So circling back to something that I was talking about before, where I was speaking a little bit about, what are your intentions around, microdosing, and for some folks, they want to just like keep the after effects of the experience going, in which I would really have you questioning your relationship with the medicine and the psychedelic itself. And then there are some folks who want to use microdosing as a tool for integration, which I do think that there's a good amount of validity in wanting to explore this. But I also think that there's a couple of things to consider. The first piece is really about having the opportunity to establish a new baseline for you post macrodose or post large dose experience, whether it's your first large dose experience or your 50th. I think that after every psychedelic experience, it's important to get yourself back down to a baseline that is not influenced by other substances, other medications, other variables that you may need to account for, including microdosing. This is the same as where most facilitators suggest that you have a clean baseline going into a psychedelic experience and limit your intake on caffeine, other medications, maybe you're tapering off of a certain medication. So it's a little bit of the same thinking process or thought process for post experience, where you likely went through some type of an experience. This is if you had achieved a psychedelic effect. There are plenty of folks who go through psychedelic experiences and then don't have a psychedelic altered state of consciousness. However, when you're coming out of that, oftentimes there's a lot of things that you feel may have shifted. Some tangible that you can like grasp and feel and name and identify, and some very intangible, or as Michael Pollan, says, the author of How to Change Your Mind, he says ineffable. Yeah. Hard to explain, hard to, pinpoint. And so giving yourself time to establish a new baseline after a psychedelic experience, I think is really helpful, Because what you're doing is you're trying to give yourself a little bit of a comparison point. Like, here's how I was feeling emotionally, physically, mentally, and spiritually leading into the experience. Now that I'm X amount of days after a psychedelic experience, here's my new baseline, emotionally, physically, mentally, spiritually. And then also just knowing that the almost the subperceptual effects, some of the positive benefits that folks feel in a psychedelic experience, that can also last weeks or months before those effects, start to fade a little bit as well. So I think that it's worth just giving yourself a piece of data to see, okay, here's how I'm feeling a week after my psychedelic experience. And then maybe you give yourself another 1 to 2 weeks. Now, let's say you're 3 weeks out of a psychedelic experience and you're like, interesting. Here's what's faded away. Here's what has remained for me. And then here is, my best guess of what my baseline is emotionally, physically, mentally, spiritually. So what I mean by that is emotionally, like, am I still generally feeling the same emotions in the same volume, right? So one of the things I talk about is folks generally have like a few emotions that they call their emotional home. Some people live in the emotional home of anger. Some people live in the emotional home of anxiety. Some people live in the emotional home of grief and sadness. Some people live in the emotional home of joy or connectedness, to others. It's kind of like when all the variables in life kind of hit you, what's the default like emotional state that you go through or go to? So this might be an interesting discovery to see, has that shifted? Leading into the psychedelic experience, I was generally feeling a little bit lost and a disconnection to others. How is that feeling now? Okay. After the psychedelic experience, I'm still feeling that, but there are these other things that might be present for me as an example. So I think it's worth giving yourself a little bit of space and time and room to explore that. And I hope that that little, example on what that might look like for you emotionally is helpful. I think the same can generally be adapted to, your new baseline physically and mentally. For example, I have plenty of folks who come out of, psychedelic experiences and they're like, I've been so disconnected to my back. I didn't know that my back was in this much pain. Or a couple of my past clients have noted, like I feel like my like brain is lighting up after, the psychedelic experience. I'm curious why or what's happening there or whatnot. And so I think that if you give yourself a little bit of time after a large dose psychedelic experience before you microdose, and then also being mindful of other substances, like I would also argue to give yourself a little bit of time before you get back onto your natural cadence of caffeine, for example, or your sugar intake, for example, a really powerful drug being sugar there. And then also, I think this same content can be applied to yourself, spiritually. And so, I guess what's coming through here is that regardless of if you choose to microdose after a high dose experience or when, I think that those are some of the more tangible questions, like how long should I wait? I think that it's really helpful for folks to track some data here, whether that's journaling or note taking or a little voice memo or voice audio. I think it's worth for you to check in with yourself before the experience, maybe as soon as you can after the experience, and at different intervals check in with this kind of checking in with your baseline type of mentality for a couple of months afterwards. There are a lot of folks who move through a psychedelic experience and after, let's say, 4 to 6 weeks or something, the effects start to fade. They're like, I don't know if I got anything out of it. Well, if you're not tracking the data, you may be missing out on noticing these little sub-perceptual effects and things, because remember, the brain is very powerful. Your mind is very powerful. It can convince you in and out of a lot of different things. And so if you are not tracking some data, at least doing a little bit of self introspection periodically, then you may not be able to like gain that trend over time to really see, what is my new baseline? What emotional content is coming up for me? What am I feeling in my body? Has the way that my mental internal landscape has that changed, at all? Do I feel different, spiritually or in connection, with others and things, beyond me? These are just general queries that I would ask when trying to assess this baseline. So now you see, if you start to introduce microdosing, and let's say microdosing generally gives you a positive effect of more stress resilience, more mood enhancement, let's say, for example, it then becomes really difficult to determine if the change is coming from the microdose or if the change is coming from a new shift in your baseline. For some folks, they might say, doesn't matter to me. As long as I have the benefit and the, so on and so forth, then I'm good to go. For other folks, they might be interested to see, can I achieve the state of being without the need or the support of another substance or a drug, even if it's a psychedelic substance. So these are your choices, of course. And the best that I can do is just invite you to think more broadly or more holistically in terms of what is my relationship with this psychedelic, and then you define what a healthy relationship is with you. I will say that no amount of psychedelic work is a replacement for your own internal work, for your own internal discovery, for your own internal inquiry, for your own internal suffering and processing, through that. I think certainly they can be an accompaniment and an aid, but also, I urge folks to keep things in balance as it relates to your principles and integrity around how you are approaching psychedelics. I think the other question that I would really consider when we're talking about using microdosing as a potential tool post large dose experience is really referring back to this non-specific amplifier effect that you've heard me discuss throughout many episodes. As a reminder to folks, what we are seeing is that generally serotonergic psychedelics have this non-specific amplifier effect, which broadly means that there can be content that is either latent within you or that has less of a presence that can come forth and become very present, sometimes very loud, sometimes very like in your face as content comes up in your life. So what does this look like? For some folks who are, let's say, addressing fear and anxiety, sometimes that fear and anxiety will heighten itself during and after the experience as a means to really connecting and being engaged in that content. Sometimes it's the feeling of this heightened fear and anxiety that can help you dissect that a little bit and be like, where is this actually coming from? And how can I actually, process through this? For some other folks, let's say you have the same thing, fear and anxiety. For some other folks, it can be amplifying this effect of like safety, for example. So maybe for some folks, you have not felt very safe in your life, and then all of a sudden there's this amplifying of like, I am safe in my body. I am safe in what I'm doing. I do have safe people around me. And that could be another example of this non-specific amplifier effect. So I guess to sum it all up, this non-specific amplifier effect is really bringing more content into your therapeutic process. So we also hear a lot of folks who say, I've done talk therapy for a number of years, and I feel like I'm at a point now where there's no new content. We're not like getting anywhere. And a lot of folks may actually engage in psychedelics as a way to surface new content or a way to establish new content that they can take back to therapy or take back to other therapeutic alternatives. And so that I think can really help define the non-specific amplifier effect. What that means in the context of microdosing is I always ask this question, is microdosing helpful for your integration process, or is it bringing up more content? So this is an interesting thing where, you may be microdosing for the positive benefits that you may be perceiving. And at the same time, there's this non-specific amplifier effect that's bringing up more content, but you already have a whole like backpack full of content that you're needing to integrate and process from your large dose experience. And so that can often be overwhelming. And what I share with folks is that, I think the ripest time to work through content, post a large dose experience is probably in that like 1 to 3 weeks. But I also remind folks something that Andrew Huberman said at a talk at the Psychedelic Sciences conference last year is that neuroplasticity is not an event, it is a process. And so I personally, and with working with some of my clients, have certainly seen integration processes go weeks, months, years, definitely years can be possible. And so it kind of speaks back to what I share as far as just like general knowledge with folks is like, do you feel like you've integrated everything that you can out of an experience? And there may be a couple of things lingering. There may be a couple of things. I'm not saying like, do you have all of your answers question and you have all of a sudden this like massive clarity and moving forward in your life, but it's just this feeling of, have I done as much integration work as I can? And I think that can be very telling on whether you should microdose and when. So, my general, very broad best advice for folks is to wait at least 2 weeks. I think that that's, a number that can be played with, a little bit. But if I was, working with my clients and there was an interest in, microdosing, I would say, hey, give yourself at least 2 weeks. Let's see how this integration process is going for you. Let's see what your new baseline is. Let's see what content is coming up for you. Let's check in with your current life situation and seeing if you have the stability and the room and the space to go through an integration process, or you might not. You might be really busy with work and family and friends and, so on and so forth. So that also might not be the right time. I find that on, I think 2 weeks is the earliest. I also think that it would be really reasonable for that process to unfold over 3 or 4 weeks as well. One of the really beneficial things about microdosing is that, especially when you're talking about like psilocybin or LSD, those seem to be the two psychedelic substances that people benefit from in microdosing. You can start and stop with very little, let's say, like negative side effects or withdrawal effects. I'll also note that there's folks out there who microdose and they aren't perceiving any of those positive effects at all. Maybe it's a non-specific amplifier thing that's like heightening, what they have going on in their life. And that's where I really think the support of a microdose coach, a facilitator, even a psychedelic friendly licensed mental health professional can be really, really supportive there. So that wraps up my rant on microdosing after a large dose experience. I hope that that was helpful to our listeners. And also just invite you to reach out to us if there's any further conversation to be had that might be more direct and helpful to you. You can certainly reach out to us at support@psychedelicpassage.com. And then also check out the other platforms that we have where we've been engaging with folks. Our different socials, primarily YouTube and Reddit, have been a lot more active there. And you can click the link in the bio of this episode that can help you find more. And before we go, I'm going to read a testimonial that we got from a caller that chose to have a consultation with our concierge team. And they said, I've been blown away by your resources, blogs, podcasts addressing safety concerns, careful outlines of steps in the journey, and your professionalism. It's also clear you folks are coming from the heart, which I think most of us who seek your services are as well. The extent of your knowledge, professionalism, and obvious care builds trust, which is everything to many who pursue this intentional journey. Thank you. That means a whole lot to us. We are at a place in time in the psychedelic landscape where there's not a lot of clear options out there. There's not a lot of clear pathways. There's not a lot of legal pathways in doing this work. I also acknowledge that we are at a place in time where folks are suffering quite greatly, whether that's mental health or spiritually or soulfully or suffering from the heart. And it means a lot to for folks to give us this feedback, because we try to imagine that there's a human at the end of every podcast episode, blog, email, and conversation. And that is a really big part of our guiding compass and our North Stars. So thank you so much for tuning into this episode. That wraps it up for us this week. And we look forward to tuning in with you next time.